introduce her and start?
No, she's actually going forward.
Is it okay if we start? Am I broadcasting? Can you hear me? Maybe it was on the computer. Through the speaker. Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?
My check.
Hello? Oh, I am hot. Good afternoon. Keep backing it down. It's awfully loud. Check 1, check 2, check 3, check 4. Is that acceptable? Volume? Good afternoon. Is everybody having a good time?
Yes.
Anybody eating corn today? Is there corn in our future? I don't know. My name is Jeff Mann. I am giving a talk called More Tales from the Crypt Analyst because I used to be a crypt analyst at NSA. I've got about 40 minutes to give you a whirlwind tour of my life at NSA, primarily over about a 10-year span. I currently work for a company called Online Business Systems. I'm mentioning them simply because they paid for me to come here today. And we are hiring pen testers and consultants. I first want to start off by apologizing. I'm going through a lot of history that goes back over 20 years to, I worked there 86 to 96, so 20, 30 years ago. And we didn't have a whole lot of really cool screenshot technology back then, so I struggled to find images to make this interesting, but so bear with me. I come from a primitive time. I should have dropped this slide. I did have a version of this 2 days ago at Vericon where I had a lot more dates in it to try to quiz you. I think I only left one in, so there'll be an important date in history. Be on the lookout for that. But just to start off, just for fun, does anybody know what's the significance of this date in history? Any guesses? Very important. So yeah, this is really a talk about my 10 years at NSA, 1986 to 1996. During my time there, I did a couple different things. I started out in photography. I was actually working on what was then called the InfoSec. In fact, it was called ComSec, Communication Security, when I started there. And I was working in what was called a manual systems shop. So I was working with primarily paper crypto systems. Did some systems design, went to the outside, did some cryptanalysis, and so on and so forth. It's really what the talk's about, but that's the summary. Yeah, I'm still hot.
Yep.
Is there some place I should avoid standing? I want to stand in front of my stuff.
How's that? Better?
Is that better? Yeah, that's better.
Okay.
I like it better.
There's a little bit of
Yeah, there's some buzz in it. My first tour at NSA, as I said, was in what was called the Field System, manual crypto systems shop. I was there because paper had been neglected because technology in the mid-'80s was taking over. Technology back then was a lot more radios and equipment, and so the reliance on paper crypto systems was believed to be less and less, and so it was sort of neglected until at some point they realized nobody had looked at any of these crypto systems for many years, but they were still being used. And in fact, because technology allowed for the printing of paper to be a lot easier, there was actually a proliferation. So I was essentially working for an organization that was evaluating crypto systems that were in the field to make sure that they were still robust enough cryptographically to be used. And I had a customer, I won't say who it was, but I had a customer that came to me very early in my career that used something called a one-time pad. Does anybody not know what a one-time pad is? Good. So a one-time pad is the most secure crypto system in the world. It is unbreakable as long as you keep that key safe and use it only once. It's unbreakable. Not like cryptography today, even though it's we're fast approaching the quantum era. But because it's man-made, because it's machine-generated, there is always a solution. maybe not in our lifetime, it would take 10,000 years to solve it, but it's solvable. Not true with the one-time pad. Cannot be solved. Anyway, a lot of it was used back in the day, and we had a customer that came to me and came to my office and said, you know, we've got this newfangled thing on our desk, this PC. Is it? I'll do this one. This is broken. Is there any way we can do the encryption and the decryption with the computer? Because it takes hours to write out these messages, character by character by character. I said, yeah, that makes sense. We ought to be able to do that. So I sort of worked with some people, and basically I ended up being a project manager, coming up with a way to do cryptography in software, which was sort of never been done before at NSA. I had a chief scientist very early on say, you know, not to me personally, but in a presentation, from an NSA's perspective, there really is no such thing as software. We only do hardware or firmware. But we did it. We put the one-time pad key on a floppy disk. We wrote a program that did the function, the algorithm, encryption and decryption. In doing that, and I bring this up because later on we're going to talking a little bit more about hacking and penetration testing. But this was sort of my formative years at NSA, and I actually drew this like pixel by pixel in some early program. I don't remember what it was. And I had this pinned up on my cubicle for years because in designing this system, I had to go through an approval process. It was very structured. There's a lot of procedure to it. It was government, and I had to write all the code and write design the whole system according to what was called the Functional Security Requirements Standard, FSRS. But the whole thing was written for hardware, and I was doing something in software. So I basically had to follow it, but I had to rewrite the whole thing. And this caused a lot of consternation from my management. I had a boss, and that was, his name was Coons, so that was his door there. And I always thought this was kind of humorous because a lot of times these things that I was trying to write to just didn't make a whole lot of sense in terms of software because they were written for hardware. I was able to get it fielded. Senior management approved it. They said, please don't do this again. But I met all the requirements, and this is me getting some small cash award for having fielded this system, which to my knowledge was the first software system of any kind that NSA produced. So that was my first year. We had a couple customers that had different forms of one-time pads and things, so we started doing a lot of that. So it was kind of cool. My second career at NSA then was I became a cryptanalysis intern. So I went from the defensive side of the house, and it was InfoSec by then, over to operations. Operations is what most people are familiar with if they have any knowledge of what NSA does. NSA is in the business of listening to the rest of the world and figuring out what the rest of the world is saying. I had been up the road from Fort Meade, and so I went down to the main campus. I worked in several of those buildings. As an intern, I did 6-month diversity tours, so I would spend some time learning different skills in different offices. Has anybody ever seen Enemy of the State? If you recall a scene where like the bad guy is coming to work and he's in a stretch limo, dark windows, and they're driving underneath one of those glass buildings, that's real. It's really how you get to the loading docks, where food gets delivered to the cafeteria and such. I always thought that was kind of funny from that movie. During my time as an intern, I happened to be there during Desert Shield, Desert Storm, which was kind of cool because I got to see NSA really do something. It was a real world mission. It was a real active mission. And so I got an award for that. Ultimately, I was certified as a cryptanalyst. One little story from this time. Oh, I took it out. So you don't get to hear it. Too bad. I wish I'd have left it in. I'll just tell it to you. Has anybody ever heard of the crypto statue at CIA headquarters? Yes, I've never seen pictures of it. It's a rather famous puzzle for people that are into cryptography because it was produced probably in the late 80s is when it was put out there. I took a field trip one day with all the cryptanalysis interns. We went to CIA headquarters and we saw their statue there, and we were all kind of offended because, like, we're NSA, we're Crypties, you know, what's this doing at CIA headquarters? So a bunch of us like found scraps of paper and we took turns writing all the code down, and we brought it back, and we got permission from management, and we had all sorts of ground rules. We weren't allowed to use any NSA equipment, we couldn't use the supercomputers, we had to kind of do this on our own time, but we tried to break the thing. If you go to Wired magazine, if you search for the crypto statue, there's an article that came out, probably been 4 or 5 years ago at this point, that talks about a guy that was a CIA employee that broke most of the code. It's never been completely broken. And a month or so after that article, there was another article that came out that said, well, before this guy did it, NSA apparently did it years before this guy did. And that's when I felt like when it was in the press that I could talk about it. So I was one of those interns that was, you know, bringing this back to NSA and trying to break the thing years before this guy at CIA headquarters did it. But more relevant to our conference is my third career at NSA. I went to work for, back on the InfoSec side, my last tour as an intern was in a shop that was called Fielded Systems Evaluations. So this office was set up because, again, somebody had the idea. The way that NSA is often successful in reading other people's and other countries' communications is because other countries sometimes don't use the systems correctly, or they implement them poorly, or they don't change default settings, or like a one-time pad key. They're like, well, this is random and we don't want to waste paper, so let's use the one page for a month instead of one time. So some sort of user error, some sort of bypass, some sort of shortcut. And all of a sudden, well, I don't know what the evolution was, but somebody figured out, well, gee, if people can do it to other systems, we produce the best systems in the world, how do we know our people are using it correctly? So this office was designed to just look at our own systems to make sure that they were being implemented correctly and being used correctly. So we would go out to the field and watch how, you know, radio operators would use our secure radios and things like that. You know, this is just an example of an ancient system from back in the, I think this was probably designed in the 70s, but was used for many, many years. But that's the kind of stuff that we would look at. While I was in that office, this is my other date, this is a real date that changed the world. Does anybody know what this date represents? Going once, going twice? This thing called the Mosaic browser came out. That's what it looked like back in the day. And this was it wasn't the first browser, but it was the one that made the internet popular and made the world all of a sudden sit up and take notice of, hey, we can start connecting things over the internet. The internet can become a communication medium. So that got our attention. We had a branch within our office that was called Network Systems, and the way the internet was changing so fast and people were jumping on, that got our attention. Some of the early books that I used as reference points back in the very beginning, the one on the left was considered the Bible, written by Gene Spafford and Simon Garfunkel. But notice the titles of these things. They all have to do with internet security. Back when this all started, it was all about how do you protect your systems and your networks if you're going to attach them to the internet. So the focus was how do we protect from that evil, we call it the cloud now, thing that's out there, that the internet and all the bad guys are out there and they're going to use the internet to get to your systems. So there was a bunch of guys in this office. We started looking at what does internet security mean? What does it mean to be a hacker? What does it mean to break into the systems? What does it mean to do penetration testing? The deputy director at the time, he had a vision, and this is more or less an exact quote, but he thought if he could get a bunch of really smart young hacker kids together and put them together in a group, that we could change the world. And part of the result of that was there was the first center of excellence that NSA produced, and it was called the Systems and Network Attack Center. And we got reorganized because, again, it was government, that's what we do. And we got put into this thing called the SNAC. The SNAC was designated C4, and we and many other groups were pulled together and put into this thing. And the idea was that we were going to be on the forefront of internet security. We were going to be on the forefront of discovering vulnerabilities and so on and so forth. This small group of us, myself and a couple other guys, we wanted to learn about hacking and pen testing. And at the time, the organization that owned the internet, as far as the DoD was concerned, was the Air Force. And they had set up the first security operations center down in San Antonio, Texas. It was called the Air Force Information Warfare Center. Met a couple guys. We went down there on a field trip, met a couple guys. These are two of the Air Force captains that we met. Kevin Zeiss on the left, he actually just passed away about a year and a half ago, unfortunately. The guy on the right, Scott Liddell, actually I was on the phone with him last week, just sort of reminiscing with him, back to the days of when we visited them. They went on to form a company, they and a bunch of their friends, which was one of the first companies that was a security company that was purely focused on security, called the Wheel Group. Very quickly swallowed up, as many companies were in those days, by bigger companies. I think they happened to be bought by Cisco, if I recall. But we went to San Antonio. We were down there, and they had an Air Force museum where they had a lot of airplanes out. The SR-71, that's a picture of it. We were there in 1995. The plane had only been declassified. I don't know the exact date, but it wasn't too long before that. So this was the first time any of us were seeing it for real. Does anybody know what that plane is? A-10. That was the plane that sort of became famous during Desert Shield, Desert Storm, which I was a part of. Those guys in the corner, they're part of the group that I was with. It was myself and these three other guys that went down to learn pen testing. So, we saw the Alamo, we went to the Riverwalk, and we got introduced to the 46-ounce margarita. Which is what I remember most about that trip. No, but we learned, we were in an office, we'd been reorganized, and we were in cubicle land, and one of the things we learned at AFWIC was they sort of had these little teams, and the way that they physically organized their office was to put their desks facing the corners, and it literally would have a round table in the middle. So if anybody was having a research problem, had something that they wanted to bounce off others' ideas, they'd call round tables. So we adopted that. So our little office, we reorganized and set up the round table. And on our round table, we brought back one of these 46-ounce margarita glasses, and we called it the Orb. And we filled it with rubber, the rubber balls, the bouncy balls. What do they call those things? Super balls? Super balls, thank you. We had the little kinds, so like maybe 50 or 60 of them, and every once in a while, just to break tension, we would just have Super Ball battles. We'd wing them at each other, and we powered our office on Mountain Dew, by the way. There wasn't a Red Bull back then. But we started learning about how to do pen testing, learning how to do hacking. We were learning like the rest of the world back then, and we were eager to learn, and we were very interested in learning. And because we were NSA, though, we had rules, we had bureaucracy, we had red tape, and we were doing things that had never been done before, which NSA is a pretty conservative organization, even to this day, I believe. So it was a little bit dicey at first. Nobody knew how to handle what we wanted to do, and we had to get lots of permission to do things. And permission meant you had to get lots of management sign-off, and that would take days, if not weeks, because there was paper and a folder, and it had to be passed from desk to desk, and secretary and assistant, and finally we eventually get to do stuff, hopefully. We developed a methodology. There was no SANS courses back then, no GAC, no certifications. There wasn't anything, really. But the idea of how do you conduct a penetration test, or we called it a vulnerability assessment, I don't think this has changed a whole lot. There's a way you do it. You find your targets, you learn about your targets, and you go after your targets, and then you report on it. Just to put things in context a little bit, What we didn't have back in those days, and this is just a very short list, are things that we take for granted these days, those of us that do pen testing or security research. What we did have, I'm calling it tradecraft just to be cool, and I have to give you a disclaimer here, and this is one of the political problems that we had in the early days at NSA. The rule was, what we were going after in terms of penetration testing was classified networks. And the rule was, anything you did to a classified network had to be classified at the level of the network. So anything that we did against a classified network was classified. So what I'm going to show you now, I'm not saying that we used this stuff, and I'm not saying we used it for any particular network. Are you with me? But I want to give you an example of sort of what the tool sets and the capabilities were back in that time frame that we might have known about. Nudge, nudge, wink, wink. We had network sniffers. They were boxes, they were equipments that we would plug into routers. We would wheel them around on carts. We did have, fortunate in 1995, basically one of the first vulnerability scanners came out. And it wasn't really even considered a vulnerability scanner. It would just find configuration weaknesses and misconfigurations and default passwords, and it was a relatively small list of things, but very effective because nobody was doing anything in terms of security back then. This thing called Satan. I did sneak another date in there. It's because I transferred this presentation to another computer, so I have no idea what slide they're counting basically. Something called Bug Track, which was a vulnerability sort of mailing list that would go out. It was this was the early notification back in the day, or one of the primary forms of either finding vulnerabilities or people that were doing research that would report on, hey, I'm having a problem with this. Has anybody else looked at this? This is an example. I couldn't even find one back from my time frame, but you get the idea. You get emails, you get digests, you could get like a weekly summary, and people would set up sites where you could do rudimentary searches. We had CERT advisories, computer emergency response teams. This is an example of one that came out in '96 when I was there. Read it real quick. Look weird? It was actually published at the time of the release of the movie Independence Day. So it's a CERT advisory about the alien virus. If you've ever seen that movie, that was meant to be human. We did things in terms of open source collection, what we would call OSINT today. We had a few FAQs that are out there. We had a few rudimentary sort of database query engines. Back in the early days of the internet, it was mostly mainframes that were collecting data, and they would store the data in a database because that's the only way you could search it. And so there was these tools that were designed to go out and find all the different databases, and you could do queries. It was very painful, it was very slow. We would have to find out who people were by doing domain lookups. Gopher is another example of something that went out there and queried databases. We did finally start to get search engines. Alta Vista was one of the first ones. It was one of my favorites. The browsers improved. Netscape came along. It was sort of the first commercial browser. And then finally Yahoo came along. And this is not the Yahoo that you know today. This was your grandfather's Yahoo. Much more closer to what we consider Google today. But it was the best way to go out and just find things about your target. Target acquisition, some of the tools that were available back in those days were, again, rudimentary tools like Strobe. Back in the day, there wasn't private addressing. If you were on the internet, you had an IP address that had to be registered to a class, to a domain, so you could actually define lists, and if you wanted to go after target X, you could look up and see what address space do they own. Is it a class B, is it a class A, which is simply how many addresses they have available to them. We had some rudimentary network mapping tools that were based on different protocols that were common back in the day. It's an old version of the slide. 1991, the first password cracking, or one of the first password cracking tools came out, and it was called, cleverly enough, Crack. Back in those days, the passwords were contained in the Etsy password file. They weren't shadowed, they weren't hidden. If you could get to the password file, and there were many ways that you could get to the password file, you could get the hashes, you could run crack. And crack was originally designed for testing the security of your passwords if you were an administrator. A lot of tools back in that day were. It was very common, again, back in those days, too, to find various Unix scripts, Unix applications, Unix functions. If they were set UID, which meant if there was a particular bit in the file permission set, what it meant was when the thing was running, it wasn't running as you, the user, it was running as root. And if you could halt its function, if you could interrupt it, if you could make it crash, very often it would drop out into a shell that was running as root because that's what was running. So it was a very common way to get root back in the day. Again, that's all hypothetical. That was stuff that was available. I showed you the office. I told you a little bit about it. We were trying to live the hacker culture, so we named our office the Pit. It was based loosely on somebody suggested, hey, Nash, remember they had the swamp? Let's call our office the Pit. This is actually an aerial photo of buildings that are just west of BWI Airport in Maryland. The Pit was in this building here, in that corner approximately. And it became famous a couple years ago. This book came out called Dark Territory. Has anybody read this book? Heard of this book? By Frank Kaplan. One of the guys that I used to work with got a copy of it shortly after it was published, and he sent out an email to the, we keep in touch with each other, those of us that were in the Pit. He said, guys, you gotta see this, you gotta see this. Chapter 4 is called Eligible Receiver, another story for another day. But in that chapter, there's this paragraph, and let me please do a dramatic reading for you. NSA had a similar group called the Red Team, yada, 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 yada. During its most sensitive drills, the Red Team worked out of a chamber called the Pit, which was so secret that few people at NSA knew it existed, and even they couldn't enter without first passing through 2 combination locked doors, and so on and so forth. So we got all excited. It's like, hey, we're in a book. But we really were just this office and just a couple guys. And in fact, the Pit was really 6 people, ultimately, in the very beginning. I have the permission of one other person to let people publicly know that he was part of the Pit, and that's Ron Bulla. He's the founder of Tenable Network Security, which just went public about a month ago. 2 of the other Pit members of the Pit still actually work at NSA, and so they naturally want to remain anonymous, and 2 others are out in the private sector. And again, they wish to remain anonymous. So I mentioned that we had bureaucratic problems, we had political problems, we had, NSA management didn't know what to do with those types of problems. The InfoSec side had a mission of protecting U.S. communications, U.S. networks, and we were known as the security people. And so they liked what we were doing, they just really didn't know what to do with this. As an example, June 1991, that's when this thing called PGP came out. Anybody remember PGP? It's still around today. Caused huge problems. Phil Zimmerman, who wrote it, got into all sorts of problems because back then crypto was considered, help me with the technical terms, munitions. And so they had export controls on it. And so he was getting all sorts of trouble because he was giving it away for free and it could go anywhere in the world. And it became a problem at NSA because we had a customer that was accustomed to coming to NSA to get its crypto, to get its secure communication systems. That was in the middle of this multi-million-dollar contract acquisition to purchase our product, if you will. And they came back and said, well, why don't we just use PGP instead? It's a lot cheaper. So there was this edict that went out to our group and basically all of the snacks saying, we must come up with an attack against PGP. And I won't go into the details of what they might have come up with, but they came up with something, and I'll just say that it had to do with getting an email and clicking on an attachment. But they got lots of huge cash rewards for it, and months after all the hubbub died down, they did a little brown bag lunch and learn thing, and they went over what they did. And what they did was really cool, but at some point I raised my hand and I said, wouldn't that work against our stuff? And they kind of like, oh yeah, it would. So, whatever. Again, I mentioned that everything that we did was, if it touched a classified network, it was classified to that level. So I will share one item with you that's top secret. So fair warning, I'm revealing government secrets. This is a cyber attack that we used. Ready for it? This was deemed in the early days by management to, interpreting the rules as they were written at the time, to be an attack tool because it elicited a response from the target machine. So imagine having to go through a process where you have to get permission from 10 or 12 levels of management that takes 4 or 5 weeks to get just to issue a ping command. And you're not supposed to do anything until you get all the permissions in place. And of course, we're hackers. We followed all the rules. So what ended up happening is we had to talk to the lawyers. We had to sit down and we had to try to come up with, they liked the concept of what we were trying to do, but we had to figure out a new way of doing it. So I volunteered, or I did volunteer to do this, to meet with the lawyers and try to come up with a way of how do we streamline the process? How do we make this work quicker? Because we could ping a box and we could do a strobe, which was a port scan, and figure out what was wrong with the box and knock it over, get root in 10, 15 minutes, sometimes less. So we really didn't want to wait a month to do that. So we came up with this scheme of I would meet with the lawyers on a weekly basis, and there was a popular show on at the time called Home Improvement. They had a little show within the show called Tool Time. So we called it Tool Time. And I met with the lawyers and I showed them, here are all the different things that we do so that the lawyers could learn and become familiar, not so much with our tools, but really with the methodology, with the strategy. Because back in those days, the tools were mostly the Unix commands and the Unix configurations, and it was features. There wasn't a whole lot of attack tools being written. It was just really knowing how Unix worked. So we did Tool Time. Word got out. We were in demand. This is actually an article that appeared back in 1998, so just about 20 years ago, that one of my coworkers sent to me. Don't have time to read it all, but basically it says, hey, NSA is doing all these free pen tests and people are loving it because they don't have to pay for it, but this is a problem because it's illegal. NSA isn't supposed to do this kind of stuff. As a very brief example, here's a request that came in while I was there from the Department of Justice. It had to be signed by the Attorney General, Janet Reno, requesting a vulnerability assessment against the DOJ systems. And there were rules in place that we had to follow, and it was about a 2 or 3 month process, but we had gotten to the point where the director was signing it, sent an email back saying, yeah, we'll do it. And if you look at the bottom there, my name's actually in it, so I was named as the point of contact. And right before we were getting ready to do this job, they got hacked. And this was like the first major breach of a government website, which again is another story for another day. Learned a lot of lessons about forensics because nobody had really done forensics before, and so the SANS Institute had started at that point. I was one of the contributing editors to this, one of the first documents that came out about it. The aftermath of all this, I left at the end of 96. 97, just to put this in context, June of 1997 is where an eligible receiver happened. The chapter in the book, and what that was it was the first DoD-wide sort of pen test of the entire DoD. Whole nother story for a whole nother day, but there was a symposium held at the University of Maryland University College last fall. That's a website there, you can go find it. For a month or so, well, up until 2 or 3 months ago, they actually had a recording of the actual roundtable discussion that they had. And they actually had a 25-minute video that had been produced right after eligible receiver that they'd redacted down to about 11 minutes, and they had that up on the web. I actually had a chance to watch it. It's not there now for some reason. I don't know why. But there is a little note if you go to that website. There's a guy's name and I think email address that you can write to him and supposedly get access to it. That was a huge event in terms of NSA and NSA's history of penetration testing. To put it in context, September 1st, 1997, the year after I left, that's when Nmap came out. So we all know Nmap, and Nmap's everywhere. Nmap didn't exist when I was doing what I was doing at NSA. Members of PIT, we still get together. The ones that still work, they occasionally bring gifts. And these are all available at the Cryptologic Museum. They have a really cool gift shop if you ever make it to Maryland. You can get secret sauce. You can get a special spy pen that sends out the bat signal NSA seal, so that's it being broadcast on the coffee mug. And I'm around if you want to ask questions. I'm also, if you've ever listened to Security Weekly, I'm one of the hosts on that. I talk old school stuff mostly. I'm a Jedi Master. I'm a member of the Cabal of the Curmudgeons. And to put this in context, the lawyer that I used to have to deal with is also a curmudgeon. He's the guy I have my arm around. And full disclosure, he's actually in the audience right now, which has been freaking me out the whole time. There's because this is a lot of kids here, there's a guy that runs a charity called Hack for Kids that teaches hacking skills to young people. As a fundraiser, he put out this game that's a CTF game called Freaker Life. And in that game, they have certain face cards that have really special mystical values, and I got to be one of them because I'm the pit boss. And that's us in Vegas. They got most of us together for a picture. We probably are out of time. Questions, comments, hit me up outside, especially if you want to buy me a drink or cigar. Yes?
You finished K4 yet?
I'm sorry?
Did you finish K4 on crypto yet?
No, I have not. Nobody has. And who has time? If you want to get in touch with me, follow me on Twitter. That's my information. And that's it. Thanks. Comment, question?
Yeah, I asked the people in the audience if they had heard about you before you presented today.
How many people knew who I was before today?
Oh, come on, I talked all about him in my presentation. That's all.
Oh, that guy.
How I learned at the pit, which was instrumental for helping set up Eligible Receiver 97. That was my guru. That was my Sherman.
Battle one. You've done well.
Obi-Wan Kenobi.
About 5 minutes for Q&A.
Oh, we do have 5 minutes. Does anybody else have any questions? That I probably can't answer. Yes, sir.
Is it true NSA backs up my hard drive?
Like I said, I don't know. I haven't been there in 22 years. Who knows what they do? Probably not. Yes, sir.
When you were doing analysis of pencil and paper systems, were you focusing on foreign systems, or did you try to decrypt any American systems?
Our mission was, it was all foreign.
All foreign?
Yeah. I mean, when I was learning, we had some, there's certain classic crypto puzzles out there throughout history that we sometimes dabble at. In fact, I got a folder of them still around on my desk somewhere. Pull it out on a rainy day, which are less and less frequent. But no, we were focused all on foreign. Yep. Any other questions?
Where's the company you work for nowadays then?
Winnipeg, but we're a virtual company.
Okay.
Yep.
I lived in Winnipeg a year ago.
Ooh,
Fishing trip though.
I've never been there.
Hey, I have a question.
Yes.
Do you have a concern that law enforcement does from legitimate surveillance and not being able to get to what you guys need or what you think the NSA needs to do their job?
That's been when I was there at NSA, one of those growing pains problems is, see if this sounds familiar, putting backdoors into crypto. That was one of the solutions to PGP, because people wanted to use PGP, it was free. So NSA back in those days came up with something called the Forteza card. And there was something called the Clipper chip, which basically would have a secret master key that would be escrowed, and only NSA would get access to it, or military or intelligence with the proper permissions and the proper court orders and things like that. And it wasn't received well then, and I don't think things have changed a whole lot. I did hear, I was at a conference a couple months ago, and Coney was one of the speakers, and he gave a pretty interesting legal justification of why the expectation of the government to be able to have some sort of backdoor cryptography built into things so that law enforcement can do its job. It was a pretty interesting argument. I don't know that I could do it justice, but he basically said, if I could summarize, throughout history, you have the right to privacy, you have the right to have not the military or law enforcement enter your home unless they suspect that you've committed a crime and they get warrants and stuff. And so he sees a natural extension of that into the electronic and digital world. I'm not throwing out an opinion one way or the other. Any other questions? Thank you.
All right, we have a 15-minute break before the next presentation.